Good morning, Dr. Richards. We're back
Morning.
after a week off. You were a little bit ill. Hope you're feeling much better.
I'm on the mend. I'm on the
Nice.
mend.
Nice.
Yep.
Good. All right. So the last time we got together, we finished our discussion on the markers of control within the movement continuum. To review that, we're looking at these positions and transitions within a movement, and we're going to look at, is there pain? That would be our first marker of control. We're looking at the breath. Can they control a breath? And we talked all about that. Postural control, talked about what we're looking for there. And then finally, we talked about impact control the last time we got together. So now what we're going to look at today is, all right, we've done the assessment initially of looking at the positions and transitions. How do we take people farther? How do we progress them? And we'll also break that down into positions and transitions. So today we're going to just talk about how do we progress or challenge a position in a very gradual way that fits still into this continuum idea. We'll go back and forth here. I'll just start by saying there's 4 categories that I tend to look at when I'm trying to add challenge to a position. So one, we want to look at adding external support or manipulating external support. So sometimes this is actually, we have the idea of what we want the original position to be. So it's always easy to use the squat as an example, right? You have the bottom of the squat, the top of the squat is just standing, but a lot of times if we're going to challenge the squat, we're going to probably be doing something towards the bottom where there's more range of motion demands. But for some people, that's impossible to do and to spend much time there early on for a variety of different reasons, which we've already assessed looking at our markers of control. So we oftentimes have to make that easier. And when we make that easier, we have to add external support. So we can do that by having the client hold on with their hands to a pole. We can have them, this is probably the most common way, is just sit onto something, right? So sit onto a chair, sit onto a progressively lower box, right? That's adding external support to the position. And then we can give them some cueing in that position when they're feeling a little bit safer there, when they can actually spend more time there. So we'll manipulate that. And then along similar lines would be, we would manipulate pillars of support. So that could be if we have some type of intention of moving someone from 2 feet to 1 foot. So moving from somewhere like a single leg squat, when we were starting with a double leg squat, we're going to manipulate pillars of support. That's usually like a big jump. So I think what works better there is something like a bird dog or a quadruped position, where we literally have 4 pillars of support, and then teaching someone to go to 2 pillars of support, or even progressing or transitioning to something like a one pillar of support, going from quadruped to kneeling or something like that. But the idea would be is we understand that there's a challenge being added because we're taking pillars of support away. And that could be really, really fine-tuned. That could be, we have 5 fingers on the ground and, we want to go to 4 fingers because taking the whole hand off is not in the card yet. So, that could be whatever it needs to be depending on where people are in the progress, but in the process. So that to me is important, that you always have that option to be really, really fine-tuned, but oftentimes clinically you don't need all of that detail. And then the third category would be to look at changing range of motion or leverage. So we can think about this in like gymnastic terms or mobility, where we're, the farther we get into range of motion, the closer we get to end range, that's a bigger challenge to contract your muscles and be strong than if you're in some type of mid-range. And that speaks to the length tension relationship of muscles, which we could discuss more about. Or we can look at like gymnastic movements where we might start with something like a plank, or some type of arm balance where our knees are tucked, but as our knees get straighter or our legs get straighter, now our body is longer, which makes it heavier. So we're, adding challenge to a position just by changing the leverage there. And then finally, once we've, gone through all of that with just body weight, where we've added challenge, we can actually add resistance to a position. So we can, just standing and we add weight to it. Well, now it's a carry, and that makes the position of standing challenged to a greater extent. We can give a weight to the bottom position of a squat. Sometimes that adds a little bit of assistance if there's a need for a front load to counterbalance us falling on our ass. Giving a weight in front can actually be assistance, but then it can also be resistance, as we have to hang out down there a little bit longer. So just those are the broad categories.
Yeah.
I'd like to just kind of go back and forth talking about some of the experience you have with how you look at going and adding some of this challenge to clients, and really like where you see some of the value that, you know, or maybe where some of the mistakes that are often made, where with moving too quickly with adding challenge to some things.
I'd honestly look at it from a really similar standpoint as you. I think I probably blend a little bit the external support and pillars of support into one another.
Right.
But really with the same idea, like you're kind of giving the client more constraint or reference to actually be able to hold and maintain that position. And that's really, I guess, the really general way I think about it is just how much constraints does this person need in front of me, or how much do I want to give them, determined by kind of how much room for error are you wanting to allow? And that's context dependent. I'd be interested to hear kind of your take on that. And then honestly, just the rest of it, I think the common thing we kind of touched on before we got on air here is adding resistance too quickly really as like a first means of adding challenge when maybe, especially when we're talking about positions, we want to be able to see someone maintain a position for a longer amount of time using less pillars of support, or less external support or longer levers before actually adding load, you know, really quickly. And that's really just my quick take on it, but I'd be interested to see what you've seen having been in practice far longer than I have. Not to date you at all.
Well, I think it's, you know, the discussion here is sort of, you could be doing several things at one time, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, the term continuum to me doesn't mean like a linear progression. It means that we're sort of, it's like a check, you know, it's like a checklist where you don't have to hit the checklist in the exact order, but you want to be aware of everything that's on the checklist, and you at some point you want to get things in, and you can look at it as there's a bunch of things that are important for someone's movement, but it really does depend on the intent for what you're going to add first and how you're going to add challenge. So again, if we use the squat as an example, and again, we can use any movement here, but the squat I think is easy to visualize, where if we are just working on someone's range of motion of the squat, well, adding external support and giving them more time to be in that position, and you use the term, you know, like a buffer zone, like kind of giving them some extra safety there. That's going to be really important when we're thinking about trying to improve mobility, because you have to be able to spend time there and you have to feel safe there. If we're adding some resistance, well, maybe we are looking at building strength, but maybe our duration is going to be a lot less time, and we're probably not going to want to put people into positions where their joints are threatened nearly as much. So we can add resistance to a carry much sooner than we can add resistance to something that's the bottom of the squat for most people, just because the joints are in positions that for a lot of people would be more threatening. Where if you're adding weight to the side or holding weight like a farmer carry at your side, it's just a standing position is not as threatening for the most part for people. So that you can mix and match all of these categories. And we could be using them at the same time with the, you know, to work on different things on different days. So I think it's just important to look broadly and, you know, it's like scan back and say, okay, what is the weak point? What is the low hanging fruit with this person? And then, you know, are you working on something that's around pain? And if you're doing that, then pain trumps everything, right? So if we're in more of a rehab setting, we're really going to make sure that we train them with a big buffer zone around pain so that we're not irritating anything. But we may find that, you know, adding resistance is fine for certain positions that are nowhere near pain, but others we have to be really careful, and that's where it's going to be an external assistance game. You know what I mean? So it's really depending on what you got in front of you, but you don't have to feel like it's a linear process of trying to go through this, you know, one step at a time. It's really just, you know, every day might be a little bit different, and you're trying to master the position overall.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important to just think about the actual goal of the exercise that you're trying to do, as you stated, because that is going to kind of dictate what you're manipulating at what time regarding those 4 categories. Talking about mobility and kind of coming back to the squat, I know I've seen you use a lot, like just holding on to a pillar or a band or something in front of you and just trying to sink into the bottom of the squat. Would that be an example for you of using the external support, I would assume?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when you do that, you can oftentimes combine the external support with the pillars of support manipulation, just because you put somebody in a position where they feel more controlled than they otherwise would, in the bottom of that squat is in that example. So, you know, you can have somebody work down to whatever they feel their restriction is in the squat, and have them adjust their position so it'll move away from anything that feels threatening from a pain perspective. But then we can also have them add muscle contractions, right? To pull them farther into the position, or something along the lines of the functional range conditioning world or PNF world, where we add a contraction away from where the restriction feels, right? So we're getting the joint and the muscles on the joint to work on both sides while we're right at that end range of their restriction. But then we can also look at saying, okay, now they have 4 pillars of support here, basically, where you have 2 hands on a pillar, 2 feet on the ground. Can I gradually go to moving 1 hand off the pillar? So now you have 3 pillars of support. They're getting closer to not needing that external support, but they're staying in that depth that they couldn't do before, right? And I think that can seem tedious, but when you have a person in front of you, you want to have a system that is really tedious, and then like be happy that you don't have to go through every step because they're progressing well. You know what I mean? But you will find people that are very, very sensitive to change, with their body, especially when we're working as physical therapists. So to be extreme in the, you know, step-by-step nature in which we view progression is a good thing, but we won't have to use it all the time. But I like that idea of saying, okay, like, we know what the end game is, but we have to really, really be good at this, you know, distilling things down into small steps. And, you know, we can be overwhelmingly with like tedious with that, and we can explain that to the patient, where you're really in more control than you think, right? So if it started to hurt when you went from, you know, 4 pillars of support to 3, well, go from, you know, a full hand to fingertips, and then we could take 1 finger away, you know, each day, each week. But there is progress that can be made there. So it's really just showing that path going forward, and it can be as slow as it needs to be. So I love the idea of having that in the patient's or the client's mind, but they often won't want to be that slow, understandably. So then it actually like makes progress. You make progress quicker because you realize, okay, if I needed to, I can go there, but I don't need to.
The squat's interesting, just thinking about this conversation regarding it specifically, because we talked a little bit about like sometimes adding a weight at the bottom of squat actually can help you a little bit.
Right.
And that's where it's like these aren't really a sequential order as much as just flipping and flopping between them, because sometimes what I've seen with like some of my clients is if we're using a hand supported squat to kind of sit at the bottom, sometimes the easiest progression is just adding a light load in front of them and ditching the pull. And then, it just helps them stay upright, but it doesn't give as much kind of counter force against them to keep them upright.
Yeah. And it's funny, like a weight could fit into the external support category, depending on what the weight is. And then you add a little bit of weight, now all of a sudden it becomes in the external resistance category. Right. So there's a sweet spot there. And then you can almost fit that into the leverage category too, right? Because it's a counterbalance. So one of the ways that you can also decrease challenge to a squat is just elevate the heels, right? Like we both do that quite a bit. And I would say that fits into your sort of manipulating leverage, range of motion. But the same thing is kind of happening when you add a front load, right? Because why do you squat better if your heels are elevated? Well, it's because like the goal, most of the time people will compensate by being too forward, right? They'll move forward into the front of their feet. They'll bring their head and shoulders too far forward. They have a hard time maintaining that vertical line going down, or that relatively vertical line going down, for a variety of different reasons. So when you elevate the heels, you can feel like your head and shoulders can stay back more, because you're not being pushed forward into the ankles is more, you feel like you can fall back and not fall over, right? Well, that's the same thing that's happening when you add a front load, if the front load is not too overwhelming in the squat. So again, all these categories they're broad categories, but what looks like external resistance might actually be assistance depending on the load that you're working with.
Yeah, that ties a little bit back into what we talked about. I think it was last time or the time before when we were kind of talking about transitions a little bit. And, I think the word I was using was like yielding and overcoming or, loading to unload. And I think that that ties right back into how much weight you're using can either help you get into a position, or at a certain point, it's going to be too much where it's actually hard to maintain it. Now you mentioned a little bit, talked about FRC. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of how that fits into what you're thinking about regarding leverage and range of motion and using muscle contractions to actually help you move into and out of end range positions?
Yeah, I think FRC, functional range conditioning, what they've done is they've really popularized the idea of taking people to end range and adding muscle contractions to that. I mean, and it's not necessarily a new idea, right? Like we learned different principles in school, PNF that was doing that, but it seemed to have a lot more of a clinical sense. You almost needed a neurological condition that was very low functioning for these techniques to be used, where I think functional range conditioning has brought it into the world of fitness, and it's combined a lot of different worlds with rehab and fitness. But it's really just when you take the body to an end range, and like anyone has experienced this naturally, where it's just like if you're at the end of a stretch, if you feel like you're really, really stretched out, you don't feel very strong there, right? You feel imbalanced. You feel like you need some support to actually keep your body in there. So what that is, though, basically is it's just adding challenge to the position. So I think a good example would be if you look at something like a half kneeling position, where you're kneeling with your knee right under your hip and your hip right under your shoulder, and then the other leg is forward at about a 90-degree angle, right? So that the position there, as long as you can kneel there, isn't that threatening from a range of motion standpoint. But if you start walking that front foot forward and that back knee back, you're going closer to a front split. Well, now it's going to be harder to actually hold on to that position without some type of external support, because you're getting deeper into range of motion. But if you're strong there, right? So if you can contract your muscles in a similar way that you could when you were in that half kneeling position, when things were a little bit more balanced, then you're still going to feel stable. So it's going to be a matter of degrees or a matter of inches until you reach a point where you no longer feel stable. But a part of that is strength training, right? Like if your muscles get stronger at greater ranges of motion and you know how to contract them in the right direction and tie that into a midline contraction, you're going to be able to be stronger into greater ranges of motion, right? But that is, to me, just a manipulation of your end ranges, right? A manipulation of range of motion from the original position. So I don't know that that's always viewed, because we'll have different terms for things, where half kneeling is half kneeling, and then like a front split is a front split. But to me, like a front split is just a extension of half kneeling if you do it inch by inch. And I think the reason it's important to describe it that way is because you see people that are in their process at different points, right? And you want to know like what you can go back to. That would probably be the safest position. And half kneeling makes the most sense. That's a good starting position because your body is the most stacked there in relation to gravity. But you also can go back to what we were talking about, is we might need to add some external support for somebody just to be in half kneeling at all, because they don't have the range of motion to even get the knee down. So you might need to elevate the knee up onto two pillars, right? But that's just a regression from a front split, or a front split's just a progression from even a very, very, supported half kneeling position. And so then it's just a matter of like how strong you are, how good are you at contracting your muscles as you get farther into that position.
Yeah, that goes right back into the fine tuning with pillars of support you talked about too. Like you can have someone take a finger off at a time, or in that case, it's like I mean, it's not necessarily once you're on or in half kneeling, it's kind of like you have two pillars of support. So you're not necessarily manipulating that as much, but you can still fine tune it again and be
Right.
like, all right, we're gonna move a centimeter. I mean, this would be incredibly tedious, but like
Yeah.
we're gonna move a centimeter further every week, or like however small you want to break it down.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and again, it like you said, that often isn't actually the case of how we use that in practice. Most
Right.
people aren't moving at that um speed, but the closer you get towards someone's end range capacity, I think the more and more important that stuff becomes, just because that progress becomes a little tougher to get when you're closer to their threshold.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think the other thing that functional range conditioning does, maybe a little heavy-handedly, is they really separate out the idea between passive flexibility and active range of motion or active mobility. They call it useful, and they call it the passive one not useful. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. They're just different things. But you should be able to, with some of your mobility work, as you get into greater ranges of motion, still be able to be strong there. And strong means that you can contract your muscles and you have a reference for what you're trying to contract. I think that's really important. We use the term reference a lot. I remember hearing that first time in the Postural Restoration Institute world. Is you have these muscle references, which are just references for position. But when you're going into deeper ranges of motion, you can also have these muscle references to tell you that you still have some semblance of control of that position. So if I'm going deeper into that front split idea, like I can't do a front split, but if I know I'm in control of moving to my closest point of a front split, if I can still feel my hip that's extended, I could feel that glute, or I could feel that hamstring, I could feel
Yeah.
my abs, right? If I'm just hanging out there, I'm not real strong there, and it's going to be hard for me to come out of that position. I'm probably just going to have to fall over to get out of the position, right? So having that ability to contract my muscles, and the same muscles that I would contract if I was in the shorter range of motion position or the shorter lever position, that's going to be important to tell me that, okay, like I can't feel these muscles anymore. I probably shouldn't go any farther right now. But by having that ability to contract, it is this continuum of flexibility and strength, right? So if I can contract my muscle better in that endpoint, well, now I have more confidence that I could start to test out these, greater ranges of motion, right? And you get more mobile pretty quickly there, and it doesn't feel necessarily like stretching at that point. It feels like just work. It's just the best way to say it. Like you're contracting your muscles, you're fighting for balance, but it definitely it feels like work, and you still feel the same stiffness, or at least I do, where I'm going, farther into this position. So it's never like, oh, I'm just loose here. It's like, no, I'm working for these greater ranges. It's just that it's interesting how far you realize you can get as you're being stronger in the positions, than if you were just trying to passively, stretch yourself into those positions.
Yeah, I think too the idea of feeling somewhat safe in those positions is probably really important for actually being able to make progress. And I don't know how you deem or look at safety with someone, but I think it's something that's often nonverbal. When someone's
Yeah.
eyes kind of light up, it's like, all right,
Mhm.
well, maybe we went a little too far, or breathing becomes a little bit erratic. Um, and that's where you touched on a little bit again before we got on air, kind of talking about these learning zones and where that real optimal challenge is, so that you're actually getting the change or adaptation we want to get. In the case of like a front split, or we can use whatever motion, but not doing too much and not doing too little. And I think you have more of a model that you learned in school or whenever you learned it, then it's a little different than what I did. So I would love to hear more about that and those zones.
Yeah, I don't know quite where I heard this actually, but I remember this learning zone model by Tom Senninger, and it was basically, yeah, I think it was more specific to when I was learning about balance, where you have this mid zone, which is a learning zone, and if you make the challenge too easy, then you're in a comfort zone. And if you make the challenge too hard, you're in a panic zone, and you really don't learn well in the panic zone because you're overwhelmed, and you don't learn well in the comfort zone because you're not doing anything, right? You're not changing anything. So you need to find that midpoint. And I think what that learning zone looks like is very different depending on what your goal is. So for instance, if we're talking about the front split, or we're talking about, improving range of motion, that learning zone for somebody feels like safety, but it feels like work in a different way, where again, like to me, the objective tell that someone's got control there is that they can still contract muscles that they want to contract, and breath control. And the breath control is, again, it's not going to be, oh, you can breathe really easy. It's that, all right, you can move the breath where you want to move the breath, and you can actually use the breath to enhance your range of motion, right? So those become two signs that you haven't gone into a panic zone, but it should feel like as much work as it can without going into that panic zone, right? So, to me, the comfort zone there is just like you're not push yourself right to that point where you feel like you're about to lose your breath control, or you can no longer feel that muscle, those muscle references, and then back off a little bit, right? So that would be like the learning zone for in my opinion, for mobility. When you're looking at something like balance, right? So let's just use like a single leg stance, for instance, right? We're going from 2 pillars of support, which is just standing on 2 feet, to gradually trying to get to just a one-legged stance. Well, what the learning zone is there should be a little bit of a wobble. There should, again, still be breath control if cued. But it shouldn't be so easy that there's no feeling of challenge there, right? So, and oftentimes people need external support. If they actually have a balance thing that they're trying to work on, they need to use external support. So you can't just go from like 2 pillars of support to 1. If you can do that well, then we probably need to challenge you more from a balance perspective, right? So when initiating challenges to balance, or when we're manipulating pillars of support, a lot of times we need that external support first that we could then pull back from, to kind of get closer to where that learning zone is, right? So we need that option to make it a little bit easier, but within the same session, you're making it a little bit harder, right? If you don't have that option, then a lot of times the balance work, the problem with it becomes that it's always panic zone area, or people just don't want to do it because they get frustrated. So you need that mid zone that you can fine tune. And I find that that's a surprisingly hard conversation. Whereas like if I'm doing something like a single leg deadlift, without weight, just to get people going through the movement, I have to like plead with them to hold on, like hold on, it's okay. Like it's not a sign of a deficit that you can't. Like I need you to, I expect you to hold on here because I'm trying to get you to control the movement. But then there's sort of like this weird pride thing that comes in where it's like I'm not supposed to be holding on, and then it just turns into, well, it's always too hard, right? So like really being able to educate clients that is part of what we're doing here, is like the support is not just because you're not doing it well, it's actually how we're going to get you to do it better.
And learning and performance are 2 different things, and like the room for error is going to be much different on those. Sort of how I learned it regarding like motor control in regards to balance, like you were talking about, single leg balance is really, if someone's performing really well, then you may not be having, like you said, it might be too easy for them, right? You're not in that mid stage. And then on the other hand, if someone can't do it at all, it's too hard. But especially with balance, you want to see some errors, and probably this applies to within reason, to all movements here, where it's safe, but there's some room for error so that there's actually learning that's occurring. And what I also learned that I think is interesting is it depends on how experienced or novel, or expert the person in front of you is with that movement. Like the more expert they are, the less error, or kind of room for error you're going to want to see, because after that, I think there's a paper by, his name's Mark Guadagnoli. I just remember learning about that. After that, on an expert level, there's a real drop off in performance. And so that kind of midpoint for them is going to look a lot different than the midpoint for someone who's completely new to the movement, where performance is probably going to be a lot lower but that's okay, just because they're going through the learning process.
Right. Absolutely. And I think like that almost becomes intuitive as you're a clinician, just because you start to see so many different qualities with someone that's an expert, right? Like the conversations you're having with someone that's a more expert movement to the movement that you're asking them to do, right? Like you could have somebody who's an expert in their sport, but then you're having them do something from a fitness standpoint that is really like something they've never done before, and all of a sudden they become a novice right away. But when you're talking about really improving performance with something that somebody's already familiar with, conversations are very much different, right? They may expect more diligent cueing, and that might be, absolutely necessary there. Versus somebody who is, brand new to it, you need to give them a bigger buffer zone for safety, and you're also likely going to be less detailed with your cueing. And I think sometimes we get that backwards because we're so careful with people that are new, that we don't let them make mistakes. And making mistakes, making errors is really, one of the vital parts of learning. So we really do have to have, that sliding scale, and it does, I think with experience, it becomes intuitive, but it's good that that's also being studied, because it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, perfect. So I think we could do a whole episode on balance. Like there's a lot with balance that is its own continuum, because a lot of times we think about balance, we just think about it with, older people that are closer to falling, but really is, balance is a whole part of this positional continuum, this discussion, and the transitional continuum, right? So, to just tease that a little bit, like we have broadly like 3 strategies of balance: the ankle strategy, the hip strategy, and stepping strategies. And all of these then just look like performance movements over time, right? Like a ankle strategy is just anything that you're doing with single leg work, right? So it could be a step up, it could be single leg deadlifts, it could be these, star excursion drills, all this stuff where your ankle, the excursion in the ankle is the number one thing you're trying to work on. And then hip strategies, they look like deadlifts, they look like hinge patterns, right? But at different velocities. And stepping strategies look like multi-directional lunges and things like that. So there's a whole discussion there that I think, again, balance doesn't get talked about enough, because we tend to pigeonhole it in this conversation with senior citizens, and it's really quite a bit more than that, and it definitely ties into performance as well. And it fits nicely into the movement continuum discussion. But the pillars of support and external support discussion here really is, I think, the start of that conversation. And to me, it's nice to have a framework around that stuff, so it doesn't just look like, this cookie cutter, stand on one leg, do your tandem stance, eyes closed, eyes open. We really want to know, that stuff is necessary, but like what are you doing there when you're doing those exercises? And how do you really make people change? Well, you actually have to have them in this system of teaching of how to learn, right? Like you have to be really educating people on these positions and this positional control. And it ties into everything we've discussed so far.
Yep. 100%.
All right. So next week we will look at, the same conversation, but adding the dynamic transitions into the mix. And again, we'll come back to when we talked about transitions in the previous podcast, we were talking about the different energy systems that we'll go through. So we'll revisit that. We'll revisit the idea of eccentric and concentric contractions, but we'll do it as we talk about progressing people in programming or in the clinic.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Likewise. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.